Welcome to On the Fringe. I'm Gavin. This is Dave, and we're here this week to talk about a incredibly important and sensitive event that is right on the forefront of everyone's minds right now, or at least it's certainly on everyone's screens. This is an event that's been going on for about 13 years at this point. Um, and it has reached what seems to be a kind of denouement, but we'll talk about what it all means in a second. While I have you guys here, I'd just like to say this is being recorded on December 8th, 2024, and what we're talking about will and can be subject to all kinds of change. So whatever we say needs to be taken with a whole bag of salt because what we're talking about is still unclear, is changing on a minute to minute basis, and will continue to change on a minute to minute basis for probably the next decade at least. So just
And
put it out there. Here's a disclaimer. Now, Dave, what are we talking about this
so I
week?
was going to say one more disclaimer too. When you hear and read about changes going on in Syria, make sure you know where that information is coming from because this country is in a very, very important part of the world, geopolitically and economically, that there are several forces at play in Syria. So make sure that you are getting real information and not just what somebody wants you to believe or hear about what's actually going on over there. Take everything with a grain of salt and think about how or why they actually wrote this the way they did.
Well said, Dave. We're talking about Syria this week, and we're talking about the kind of incredible events that have taken place over the last about week and a half that started with a offensive in the northwest of the country against the city of Aleppo and have reached a culmination in the fall of Damascus to anti-regime forces and the fleeing of Bashar al-Assad, the scion of the Assad family, which has ruled Syria for over 50 years. He has fled. The Russian government is on record saying he's fled the country, but we're still not entirely sure. It's a very, very important, very interesting situation. And do we just want to start off with the sort of key takeaways that we want to give from this conversation today, Dave?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Syria's been in the news a lot for the last 13 years, kind of on and off. And I think it's going to be in the news very much so for the next probably 5 to 10, maybe longer. This problem is not going to go away, and it's probably going to get worse. And
Mm.
within the last 10 or 15 years, you've had Iran and Russia, which have really tried to influence Syria. They've tried to use Syria as a way to project their power across the Middle East. And since this is falling apart, both of these countries are probably shitting themselves right now. Israel is very, very vigilant and they're very cautious and aware of what's going on. And Turkey to the north is probably looking at this and going, we might make a move in the next, maybe in the next month, maybe in the next week, maybe in the next year, even. But this is an opportunity for Turkey. So, with all of these players in this region, Donald Trump has to get this right. His policy for the Middle East has to be right. And if it's not correct, a lot is going to go wrong within the region, potentially for the world as well, where you're going to have spillover into Europe, potentially into the Caucasus, so Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, southern Russia, and into Africa as well. So this is a really, really big move. And this is a very, very important move that Donald Trump is going to have to make. And other world leaders as well, I have to add.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, uh, yes, so many countries are already involved in Syria. One of them is the United States. We do have a military presence in the far east of the country, in what is called the Al-Tanf deconfliction zone on the border with Iraq and Jordan. And we have a small military presence, basically guarding a border post and a couple oil fields out in the east of the country. We have a pretty close relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the main Kurdish force in the northeast, and we'll talk about that more later. Um, in the last 10 years, pretty much every major world power except for China has had armed forces on the ground in Syria. It's been one of the most proxified, one of the most internationalized conflicts on the face of the planet Earth, and they've had some competition. So, this is a very complex, very violent situation that has kind of, if you haven't been paying attention, as most people have not, as I was not really that much until about 2 weeks ago, this will have seemed like it has just exploded out of nowhere. And today we're going to talk about really how it hasn't, how this is coming from a very long fuse, very volatile situation. Um, Syria, just to start off from the extreme beginning, Syria is a big chunk of what used to be called Mesopotamia, what's now called the Levant, which is sort of the cultural core of the Middle East. Um, this is widely regarded as the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent. This is not like just some random patch of desert. This is a really important place. Historically, culturally, for Western civilization, it's been at the core of so many major empires: the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Alexandrian Empire, the Roman Empire had a massive presence in what is now Syria. Uh, the Persian Empire before that, and of course the Ottoman Empire. And it was a part of the Ottoman Empire really up until uh, the 1910s, specifically 1919. And then it became, in a very interesting way, it became a French colonial territory. This is when we really want to introduce the Treaty of Sykes-Picot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically in World War One, the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia were fighting against the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. So Ottoman Empire was kind of the weak member of the group, and the British and the French were basically thinking, okay, as soon as we get rid of the Ottoman Empire, we're going to start to divide up and chop up
Mhm.
its region and its region of influence. So basically, the French and the British started to draw lines in the Middle East, and the British were largely going to take control over modern day Israel, the Palestinian territories, most of southern Iraq and Jordan, and the French were going to get Lebanon, Syria, and part of Turkey. And if you look at the border now between Syria and Iraq, there's a diagonal line, and that's just kind of from the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they said, well, we're going to divide this up and you're going to take this half, we're going to take this half, and okay, Russia, we're going to let you in on part of this as well. Well, Russia became communist in 1917 under the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Bolsheviks leaked the documents. And this was a huge scandal for the British and the French. Woodrow Wilson was not happy at all because he was like, what are you guys doing, making these secret treaties? You guys can't do this. We're all gentlemen. We should be talking about this stuff, in terms of we're not really sharing and hiding, or we're not really hiding intelligence. We're not really hiding stuff from each other. We're working together to create kind of a better world. And it basically like didn't really work.
Well,
So,
what ended up happening is so Woodrow Wilson's brainchild after the end of World War One was the League of Nations, and the League of Nations had a very interesting history. It was conceived by Woodrow Wilson. It's totally a precursor to the United Nations. Um, but what Wilson didn't foresee, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, by the way. Uh, The Republican Party at that time was in control of the Senate and was completely opposed to the idea. So, because they had a majority, he was unable to get around the fact that they did not want to join the League of Nations. The United States never joined up. So, which two countries basically wound up being the leading figures? The United Kingdom and France. Notably, two countries that were really opposed to the idea in the first place. So, one of the things that they did while they were in the League of Nations was to come up with this whole idea of a League of Nations mandate, which was basically a way of controlling a country without formally describing it as a colony. And that's what they did in the Middle East. Uh, the British had a mandate in Palestine. That's why you talk about mandatory Palestine if you take history regarding the Middle East. The Syrian territory became the mandate of Syria, though later it was actually broken up. And part of the reason why there has been historically a lot of tension between Syria and Lebanon is because Lebanon, before the French, had been part of mandatory Syria. And then during a period where the French were basically dividing up Syria into ethnic states, they sort of hived Lebanon away as a majority Christian state, which it wasn't really. Um, but they did break it off. And without French intervention, it's unlikely that Lebanon would be an independent country today. Anyways, the French mandate was violently imposed. No one in Syria wanted it. They had to invade the country. They had to shell several towns and cities and repeatedly put down revolts with machine guns, with aerial bombardment, uh, killing tens of thousands of people in the process. Very unhappy time for the Syrian people. And this continued really up until right after World War II, where, you have to remember the French experience of World War II was catastrophic, to say the least. There was no political capital to holding on to territories that so clearly did not want to be part of the French Empire, were in fact violently resisting being part of the French Empire. And so I believe Syria gets independence late 40s, early 50s. And immediately you have just major issues with governmental stability, with repeated military coups, with interference from the United States, United Kingdom, France, the USSR to a degree. It's just not a stable place. And this continues. There's a brief period. You want to talk about the UAR, Dave?
Oh, so there's a brief period of about 3 years where Syria and Egypt linked up and they created the United Arab Republic. And basically, it was a way for Syria to kind of link up with a stronger power and they could have a more stable government. And it didn't really work very well. Syria was not really that compatible with Egypt at this time, and it just did not work. Syria was basically going through within the country, local power brokers were going and fighting one another, trying to take over the government. So you basically had a revolving door of coup after coup after coup after coup after coup. And Assad, the current, I guess, former president Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, the father, became the general and he took control of Syria in 1970. And he basically started to build a cult of personality around him, similar to Stalin and Kim Il sung in North Korea.
And the obvious comparison, because it's someone who did something very similar in a similar territory around the exact same time, actually, is Saddam Hussein. And if you want to look at two people who did fairly similar things in somewhat different ways,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the Hussein regime and the Assad regime were very, very similar. Um, in fact, they started off having the same ideology. They were both Baathists, Baath, Baathists, which is a kind of Arab nationalism with elements of socialism woven into it. It's not something I'm going to try to explain here. I don't think it was ever uh, fully articulated by either regime. Assad and Hussein were both fundamentally military men. They were not, despite all the boring books that Saddam Hussein supposedly wrote, they were not particularly intellectual people. They were uh, military guys. They organized people. Um, and they both had reputations as being brutal strongmen. And in both cases, actually, there are parallels here, despite the fact that Iraq and Syria have historically referred to themselves as Arab republics since the late 60s. Um, they're very multi ethnic, multicultural, multi religious, multi hyphenate everything places. Um, in Iraq, you have a large Kurdish majority in the large Kurdish minority in the north. You have an Arab majority, which about 80% of which is Shia. The other 20% is Sunni. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab, so he was governing from a pretty small base of support, really. And Hafiz Assad was the same thing. He was an Alawite. An Alawite is a very specific sect of Islam, of Shia Islam. It's fairly heterodox, I would say. And they're 10% of the population about in Syria. So most of the
They're
ruling,
primarily in the northwestern part of the country too, right?
they're along the coast. If you look at Syria, you'll see that the coast is actually pretty tiny. It's sort of wedged between Turkey and Lebanon. And the majority of Alawites live on that coast. They live around Latakia and Tartus. And we'll probably return to talking about Tartus later. Um, yes, so very small base of support. Um, he obviously brought people from outside the ethnic group into the regime, but generally they were not trusted as much. And one of the interesting things to talk about with Syria is there were a lot of Alawites in the armed forces to begin with because the French had brought them in as our minority. And the French have a habit of doing this in their colonial territories. They'll find a maybe not well treated minority group and they'll co opt them as their minority group because they will owe all of their positions to the colonial power. So Alawites were really promoted pretty heavily into the French era military forces in Syria. So even when they left, there was then a military tradition amongst the Alawites, and that has continued really up until the present day. Um, Assad's regime was brutal from the get go, and it did not get better. It was he was aware that the majority of people he ruled over were not particularly fond of him. Again, I would say the majority, small majority, but definitely the plurality of people in Syria are Sunni Arabs, but it is a very diverse country. You have Turkmens, you have Assyrians, you have Alawites, you have different kinds of Shia. You have the regular 12er Shia, you have the Ismailis, you have just a really diverse community of Muslims and Christians. Um, it's a very diverse place, but the majority of people were not well disposed to the regime. How do you deal with that? You co opt and you suppress. Um, uh, Hama particularly has been pretty historically brutally suppressed by the regime. Again, tens of thousands of people were murdered, thrown into political prisons. No real rule of law beyond what the party said, beyond what Assad said. He was grooming his youngest, not his youngest, his oldest son, al-Assad, for basically taking over from him. Basel died, and so did Hafiz in 2000. His son, Bashar al-Assad, took over. Now, Bashar uh, had trained as an optometrist, I believe, or an
Yeah.
ophthalmologist. I think it was an
Ophthalmologist in the UK. And he
he
was
trained to be an
actually in the UK. He was in the UK doing his I think his PhD or his residency or something like that. He ended up coming back to Syria, and his father basically took him under his wing and taught him about politics and the military and how to run a country after his brother died. And that's kind of where
yeah,
that cult of personality comes in, where it goes from one family member to another family member, similar to how Saddam wanted to give power to Uday and Kusei, and Kim Il Sung in North Korea gave power to Kim Jong Il, his son.
100%. Very similar process. Bashar takes over in 2000, and nothing really changes in the sense that it's still a pretty brutal regime. It's increasingly family run, all the major businesses. Everything under the Ba'ath regime had been nationalized. But now, under Bashar, basically what nationalization and privatization meant were that these industries were just given over to family members or associates. So it definitely moved more in that direction. It was not getting better. Human rights were still abysmal, they're basically non existent. Collective punishment, really nasty, brutal regime. There was a degree of whitewashing in the late 2000s where, there were a couple puff pieces in the Western press about, actually they're not so bad, these Assads. Um, but that came to nothing because in 2011, you had the Arab Spring, which hit Syria pretty hard. And the response from the regime was uncompromising, doesn't begin to cover it. Everyone pretty much, in the early days of the Arab Spring, if you would have said who's going to hang on, who's probably cooked, who's done, you would have said, well, Gaddafi, that Muammar Gaddafi, he's a survivor. He hasn't gone anywhere. He's going to hang on in there for a while. But this Assad guy, he just doesn't seem to be doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we were all proven pretty horrifically wrong there. Assad turned out to just be someone who didn't recognize the word compromise. He cracked down, and he cracked down in an almost unbelievable way, completely devastating the country and completely radicalizing the opposition in some pretty remarkable ways. Uh, this basically turned into a full on civil war very quickly, and it rapidly devolved to the extent that by 2014, basically the Islamic State had taken over a massive chunk of eastern Syria and was beginning to reach towards the cities in the west of the country. Really wild situation. And it's at this point where the Islamic State is really at its height that you get intervention from foreign powers who had been pretty restrained, even as evidence mounted of just massacres, use of chemical weapons, killing women and children, torturing people to death, really horrific stuff going on. There had been very limited foreign intervention. With the Islamic
Yeah,
State, Yes.
Hang on. I'm sorry. Alarm went off at my hotel. I have no idea what's going on. I'm going to mute and keep going.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully you're doing okay. Um, so, uh, with the Islamic State, then you begin to see foreign intervention. Then you begin to see U.S. involvement, Iranian involvement, and Russian involvement. And particularly Iran and Russia become very closely tied to the Assad regime. And they begin shipping in personnel, they begin providing air cover, and the United States begins establishing a relationship with the Kurdish forces in the northeast of the country that are also fighting the Islamic State. And Russian support ramps up pretty quickly. The Russians start establishing uh, air force bases and, in fact, a naval base in the west of the country in the port of Tartus. And the Iranians began shipping in basically an entire intelligence apparatus in the form of the Quds Force, which is the main branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's a special forces branch, essentially. They completely revamped Assad's internal security apparatus and began deploying personnel, mostly people from militias affiliated with the Iranian government, but not actually Iranian soldiers. And the Russians began actually putting boots on the ground. So the Islamic State and the emergence of the Islamic State and the campaign against the Islamic State, that really moves the dynamic around the Syrian civil war, and it shifts focus away from the fact that the opposition forces in the northwest of the country, which have become increasingly radicalized. The largest faction is actually at that time affiliated officially with Al Qaeda. They are doing pretty badly. They're getting beaten pretty badly, and they probably would have been annihilated entirely as the regime reinvigorated, except around this time, uh, Turkey becomes involved as well. Turkey has, I think, next to Iraq, the largest border with Syria. They
Mm-hmm.
share a very long border with the Syrians, and they essentially intervened to protect Sunni Arab forces fighting the regime in the north of the country and to establish a buffer zone against the Kurdish forces. Um, they were successful in that, and in a real way, that kind of laid the groundwork for what we're seeing today. So I'm going to be quiet, and can you just tell us what's happened in like the last week and a half, Dave?
So in the last week and a half, hopefully the alarm doesn't go back off. The alarm went off at my hotel, power's out. I have no idea what's going on. There were a bunch of people running down the stairs, and one of the guys from the hotel was like, "Everything's okay." So now he's trying to like play with the power. I have no idea what's going on, but
Oh my
looks
God.
like there's nothing on fire, and it looks like there's no earthquake, and everybody's okay. So I went back to my room. Probably not the smartest thing I've ever done in my life, but I'll roll with it for now. But in the last week, basically, I've not really paid that much attention to this apart from the last day and a half. And it looks like that, based on my understanding, that you had rebel forces, quote, rebel forces coming in, and they basically took over Aleppo, they took over Homs, and they've come into Damascus, the main power seat, the seat of power for Assad's government. He has left, and now the whole entire country is, quote, liberated. So this Syrian embassy in Doha put out a post that was very, very interesting, where they were basically celebrating the liberation of Syria from Assad. And some of these rebel groups that have come in, you have the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Gavin talked a little bit about them earlier. They're primarily Kurdish. They've been largely supported by the US for a long time. You also have groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is basically an Islamist and terrorist organization. They've done a lot of work with al-Qaeda in the past, and there's speculation and there's people talking now that these guys are actually still working together. Al-Qaeda did support them for some time. And the guy who actually leads this group did an interview with CNN, and it looks like they're taking a page from the book of the Taliban in terms of how to run a country. So these guys are looking like they're trying to take over most of the power. I'd say the power brokers in Syria, and actually setting up some sort of a nation state. So, okay, you have people coming in and collecting trash. You have the lights on. You have schools. You have jobs. You have a system where people can get up and not have to worry about where am I going to get my food every day. I can get up. I can go to a store. I can go to a stall and buy what I need. So these guys are looking like they're trying to come in and essentially be one of the main power brokers for the next, I would think, transitional period and probably longer in terms of setting up Syria or this new country of Syria, whatever it's going to be called. Do you
It's
agree,
worth
Gavin?
noting. Yeah, no, I'm still there. It's worth noting that the HTS was not involved in quote unquote liberating Damascus. The groups that liberated Damascus were basically a coalition of rebel groups that had been cooperating with the regime until a couple days ago. And they'd been in this really sort of bizarre state of an entente with the regime where they still had access to arms, but they were not actively fighting the government. They changed their mind pretty quickly when they saw the fall of Aleppo, then Hama, then Homs, or at least the entree onto Homs of HTS. When they saw that, then you had a full blown rebellion in the south, and yeah, Damascus fell basically 2 days after that. Um, a lot of questions about how much people knew when, what exactly happened. One of the characteristics of this whole thing, and we discussed this, Dave, is basically uh, regime soldiers just put down their guns and walked away.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. They lost. They had like a 14 or 15% attrition rate of people just dropping their weapons or switching sides and going, I'm done with this,
well,
which is
pretty incredible when you think about it.
yeah.
Even more than that, you had the fact that in Aleppo and in Hama, they were essentially given up without a fight. They
Hmm.
saw the military forces approaching and they left. And they kept doing that all the way to Damascus. And in fact, they've done that in Damascus. There's now an exodus of Syrian regime officials, including Bashar al-Assad. Uh, but for me, the big nail in the coffin was uh, I want to say 5 or 6 days ago, I read an article about uh, the only official Russian naval base abroad was located in Tartus, Syria, on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. The entire fleet evacuated. That everyone just left. All the boats left. The tankers left. All the personnel just left. It's a very big naval facility. Essentially, overnight, everyone was told to go home. Um, that was a pretty big indicator. The other indicator was
And
the
the
Iranian
Iranians as
gov-
well.
the
Yes.
Iranian government essentially shipped everyone out. They shipped all Quds Force personnel, all diplomatic personnel, and again, there are a lot of people. There's a whole infrastructure of people. They were even encouraging people to take commercial flights, which is when your government starts telling you to get on the next available commercial flight, that's a really bad sign. That's a sign you should have left already. Um, so they were doing that. The Russians did that. The Iranians, again, a lot of the soldiers that Iran had in Syria were not actually Iranian. There were Shias from Iraq or actually from Afghanistan or Pakistan. And we'll maybe talk about that on another podcast. Um, and those soldiers, as far as I know, have not been evac'd, but they were resituated basically to protect Shia holy sites. Um, most of those guys are still in the country, but I'm sure there are negotiations taking place about what's going to happen to them. It's
Hmm.
really unclear at this point in time. Uh, it's unclear if the Assad regime is going to try to hang on to power along the coast. My feeling, based on the last map I saw, is probably not. That's probably
I'm with
going
you. I
to
think
happen.
it's game over for Assad.
It
In
is.
Doha today, you had Russia, Iran, and I believe it was Turkey talking in
Yep.
Doha
Hmm.
about what they're going to do collectively in Syria. And these three countries are very, very involved. Also, the UAE is involved as well. They don't want to have non-state actors and terrorist groups basically running around in the Middle East like you had with ISIS back, 7, 8 years ago, and
Or Iraq.
or Iraq. And you look at this and go, okay, if you don't have a government in place, most of the Middle Eastern countries, when you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, Iraq was very stable just because Saddam Hussein was a very stable ruling leader. Was he a good leader in terms of being good to his people? Absolutely not. But he was
Well,
stable and he was strong.
well, I mean, mentally and emotionally, maybe not that stable. Um, I mean, I
Any
think I think when we
anybody
talk
that is
about stability, we can mean several different things.
predictable. Predictable is probably a better
Predictable, I think, is a much
is
better word.
probably
I
a
think he
better word
was
instead of stable. Predictable.
particularly towards the end, before the American intervention or invasion, I
Hmm.
should say.
Yep.
Um, it was a pretty predictable regime in a lot of ways. And I think you could say the same about Assad too. Very awful, awful regime. I mean, absolutely terrible in pretty much every way. Predictable? Oh my, yes. Very predictable. You knew exactly what you were getting.
Hmm.
Um, Now you have no idea. You do not know what you're getting at all. There are so many different rebel groups involved. The Syrian opposition is not close to being a coherent entity. Um, yes, there are many concerns about HTS, but I think the biggest concern about them really is that they're going to be overstretched almost immediately. They've spent the last 5 years administering a territory that's basically like a very small fraction of the total size of Syria with a population of about 4 million people. All of a sudden, even the chunk of the country that they're currently administering might be too much. They might not have the personnel to run it. You have ideological incompatibility between them. I would imagine a lot of the southern groups, definitely the Syrian Defense Forces.
Hmm.
Um, you're going to have major Turkish concerns about the Kurds on their border. That's always there. You are going to have problems with Iraq, where a lot of those Shia militias that were supporting the Assad regime came from. And a lot of them are probably now going back to Iraq. I know there's already been one case of something like 2,000 Syrian soldiers crossing the border. There's going to be a lot more of that. Um, you already, again, you have Israeli trepidation about what form the new regime might take. They're already occupying parts of Quneitra Governorate, essentially to establish a buffer zone between whoever takes control in Damascus and the Golan Heights. Lebanon, Lebanon has
Yeah.
enough problems at the moment, but Lebanon is not really in a state to impose anything. Lebanon barely has a functional government right now, anyways. They're going to be looking across the border very cautiously. Um, it is, and just to like end on the note, what happens in Syria affects everywhere. Something like 3.5 million Syrian refugees are currently in Turkey. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Syrian refugees scattered across Europe. This is a country with a huge diaspora, an important diaspora, and it's in a location that is absolutely pivotal. Again, used to be the cradle of civilization. It is in the middle of everything. And if you have outflows of people, if you have outflows of weapons, this affects everybody. This is not a tidally contained hornet's nest. This is a hornet's nest that has been flung into the middle of a crowded public swimming pool. And it is not going away. It's not going to be resolved. I'm glad that people are really happy about liberation. I know it's been a long time coming. I know, as an American, even if you have a lot of qualms about it, when you hear people talking about freedom, I think there's a part of you that goes, yeah, freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things about freedom, unfortunately, is that you have the freedom to make a lot of mistakes. And that is inevitably going to happen. That's a part of any kind of democratic process. But what's going to happen right now is a massive jockeying for position. And it will probably not be democratic. It will 100% involve a degree of violence. And it is going to be massively destabilizing for the region of the Middle East and for the planet as a whole. Because again, it affects everyone and everyone is involved. Even if Iran has evacuated, even if Russia has evacuated, they still have an interest. And
Mm.
America has an interest. We still have personnel in country. So there's no tidy solution. This is a brand new day, but who knows what's going to crop up.
Yep. Tomorrow is going to be interesting.
Indeed. Indeed.
So, with that, we will go ahead and leave you all. Thank you very much for tuning in to the episode, and apologies halfway through. If you guys heard the siren and the alarm in my hotel, hopefully it didn't interrupt Gavin too
Dave,
much. Gavin, that was
Dave,
awesome.
I'm just happy. I'm happy you're safe. I'm happy you're in one piece.
I am too.
I'm so glad that we were able to roll with that and that, it wasn't an earthquake or a fire or, whatever it might have been. I'm glad it doesn't seem to have been very much. So on that note, we're grateful for being in one piece, and let's see what happens tomorrow.
All right. Have a good one, y'all. Take care.